I'm a mortuary makeup artist, but this corpse has shown up twice this week. My name is Sarah Chen, and I have been working as a mortuary makeup artist at Riverside Funeral Home in Portland, Oregon, for the past 7 years. People often ask me how I can do what I do, how I can spend my days making the dead look alive again. The truth is, after thousands of faces, you develop a strange kind of immunity to death. You learn to see past the tragedy and focus on giving families one last beautiful memory of their loved ones. But what happened last week has shaken that immunity to its core. It started on a Tuesday morning in October. The autumn rain was drumming against the windows of the preparation room when my supervisor, Harold Vance, wheeled in a body bag. Harold had been running Riverside for 35 years, and nothing fazed him anymore. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he unzipped the bag. Inside was a woman, perhaps in her mid-30s, with auburn hair and delicate features. According to the paperwork, her name was Rebecca Martinez. She had died in a car accident on Highway 84, and her family had requested an open casket service. The coroner had done his work, but it was my job to make her presentable for her final goodbye. I pulled on my latex gloves and began my assessment. The damage was minimal, mostly concentrated around her left temple, where she had struck the steering wheel. Her skin had that waxy pallor that comes with death, but her face was remarkably intact. I had seen much worse. As I worked applying foundation to restore color to her cheeks, I noticed something odd. Her fingernails were perfectly manicured, painted a deep burgundy that seemed almost too vibrant for someone who had been dead for 3 days. The polish showed no chips, no wear. It was as if she had just stepped out of a salon. I pushed the thought aside and continued my work. By the time I finished, Rebecca Martinez looked peaceful, almost as if she was sleeping. I had managed to cover the trauma around her temple completely. And with the right lighting, her family would remember her as she had been in life. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday. Everything went smoothly. The family wept, said their goodbyes, and Rebecca Martinez was laid to rest in Mount Calvary Cemetery. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The following Tuesday, Harold wheeled in another body bag. The rain was falling again, creating an eerily similar atmosphere to the week before. I was organizing my cosmetics when I heard the zipper being pulled down. I turned around and froze. It was Rebecca Martinez. The same auburn hair, the same delicate features, the same burgundy nail polish. Even the trauma to her left temple was identical. But according to the paperwork, this was Maria Santos, a 34-year-old woman who had died in a car accident on Interstate 5. My hands began to shake as I stared at the body. This was impossible. I had prepared Rebecca Martinez myself. I had watched her family lower her casket into the ground. Yet here she was again, or someone who looked exactly like her. Harold noticed my distress. He was a practical man who believed in simple explanations for everything. When I told him about the resemblance, he just shrugged and said, "People sometimes looked alike, especially in death." He reminded me that we saw hundreds of bodies every year, and it was natural for faces to blur together in my memory. But I knew what I was seeing. This was not a case of mistaken identity or faulty memory. Every detail was identical, down to a small scar on her right eyebrow that I had carefully concealed with concealer the week before. I tried to convince myself that Harold was right. Maybe I was just stressed. Maybe I was seeing things that were not there. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. Maria Santos, according to her family's wishes, also needed to be prepared for an open casket service. As I began to work, I noticed more disturbing similarities. Not only did Maria Santos look exactly like Rebecca Martinez, but she had died in almost the same way. Car accident trauma to the left temple, minimal damage otherwise. The police report stated that she had lost control of her vehicle during the rainstorm and struck a tree. The coincidences were piling up, but I told myself they were just that, coincidences. Portland was a big city, accidents happened all the time, and sometimes people just looked similar. But as I applied foundation to Maria's face, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Hidden under her hair, just behind her left ear, was a small tattoo of a crescent moon. I remembered that same tattoo from Rebecca Martinez. I had seen it when I was positioning her head for the viewing. My hands were trembling now as I continued to work. I kept glancing at the paperwork, hoping to find some explanation, some clerical error that would make sense of this nightmare. But everything seemed to be in order. 2 different women, 2 different families, 2 different death certificates. I finished preparing Maria Santos, though my work was far from my usual standard. My concentration was shattered, and I kept making small mistakes that I had to correct. When I finally stepped back to assess my work, I was looking at the exact same face I had prepared the week before. The funeral for Maria Santos was scheduled for the following Friday. I considered calling in sick, but something compelled me to attend. I needed to see this through, to understand what was happening. The service was held at the same chapel where Rebecca Martinez had been mourned. As I watched the family members file past the casket, I studied their faces, looking for any sign of recognition, any indication that they had seen this woman before. But they grieved, as families do, with genuine sorrow and love for someone they had clearly known and cherished. After the service, I approached Maria's sister, Carmen, who had been the primary contact for the funeral arrangements. I told her I was sorry for her loss and asked if Maria had any other family in the area. Carmen shook her head, tears streaming down her face, and told me that Maria had moved to Portland only 6 months ago from Phoenix. She had no other family here, no connections to anyone else who might have died recently. This ruled out the possibility that Rebecca and Maria were related, that they were twins or sisters who had been separated somehow. They were complete strangers who happened to look identical and die in nearly identical circumstances within a week of each other. I left the funeral home that night, deeply unsettled. I drove home through the rainy streets, constantly checking my rearview mirror, though I could not say what I was looking for. My small apartment felt cold and unwelcoming, and I found myself jumping at every shadow, every creak of the old building. I spent the weekend researching everything I could about Rebecca Martinez and Maria Santos. I scoured obituaries, social media profiles, news articles about their accidents. What I found only deepened the mystery. Both women had lived remarkably similar lives. They were both single, both worked in administrative positions, both had moved to Portland within the last year. Rebecca had come from Seattle, Maria from Phoenix, but their histories were almost parallel. Both had lost their parents at young ages, both had struggled with depression. Both had few close friends or family members. Most disturbing of all, both had been involved in minor legal troubles in the months before their deaths. Rebecca had been arrested for shoplifting Maria for public intoxication. Both charges had been dropped, but the pattern was too specific to be coincidental. By Monday morning, I had convinced myself that I needed to share my concerns with someone in authority. I called Detective Ray Morrison, who handled traffic fatalities for the Portland Police Bureau. Morrison was a friend of Harold's, and I had met him several times when he had come to the funeral home to follow up on accident cases. Morrison listened patiently as I explained the situation. I could hear the skepticism in his voice as he assured me that he would look into it, but I knew he thought I was just an overstressed mortuary worker who was seeing patterns where none existed. Still, he called me back 2 days later with information that made my heart race. He had pulled the accident reports for both women, and there were indeed some unusual similarities. Both accidents had occurred on rainy nights. Both involved single-car crashes with no witnesses. And both women had been found by the same tow truck driver, a man named Eddie Kowalski, who worked the night shift for Murphy's Towing. Morrison assured me that this was probably just a coincidence. Eddie covered a large territory and worked the dangerous late-night hours when most single-car accidents occurred. But he agreed to interview Eddie just to be thorough. Meanwhile, I was trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy at work. Harold had noticed my distraction, and he was beginning to question my ability to do my job effectively. I forced myself to focus on the other cases that came through the funeral home, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was terribly wrong. Then the following Tuesday, it happened again. Harold wheeled in another body bag, and I knew with sick certainty what I would find inside. My hands were shaking as I approached the gurney, and when Harold unzipped the bag, I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling. It was the same woman again. The same face, the same hair, the same burgundy nail polish, the same crescent moon tattoo behind her left ear. According to the paperwork, this was Jennifer Walsh, a 33-year-old woman who had died in a car accident on Highway 26. I could not hide my reaction this time. Harold saw me go pale and demanded to know what was wrong. I tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled rush. Harold listened with growing concern, then looked down at the body with new attention. After a long moment, he frowned and said that there was a resemblance to some of our recent cases, but that I was clearly overreacting. He suggested that I take a few days off, that the stress of the job was getting to me. But I could see doubt in his eyes, and I knew that he was beginning to see what I was seeing. I refused to prepare Jennifer Walsh's body. I told Harold that I was too shaken to do the work properly, that he should call in our backup artist. Harold was not pleased, but he agreed to handle the preparation himself. That night, I could not sleep. I paced my apartment, trying to make sense of what was happening. 3 identical women, 3 identical deaths, all within 2 weeks. This was not a coincidence, not a trick of she. Memory or stress. Something was very wrong, and I was the only one who seemed to recognize it. I decided to do something that went against every professional instinct I had. I was going to return to the funeral home after hours and examine Jennifer Walsh's body more carefully. I needed to document what I was seeing to gather evidence that would convince others that this was not a figment of my imagination. I waited until after midnight, then used my key to enter the funeral home through the back entrance. The building was eerily quiet, lit only by the emergency lighting that cast long shadows down the hallways. I made my way to the preparation room, where Jennifer Walsh's body was being stored in one of the refrigerated units. I pulled out the drawer and looked down at the face that had haunted my dreams for 2 weeks. In the harsh fluorescent light, every detail was exactly as I remembered, from Rebecca Martinez and Maria Santos. The same facial structure, the same small imperfections, the same expression of peaceful repose. I began to take photographs with my phone, documenting every angle, every detail. As I worked, I noticed something I had missed before. On the inside of Jennifer's left wrist, barely visible, was a small puncture mark. It looked like an injection site, but it was in an unusual location for medical treatment. I examined the same spot on my memory of the previous 2 bodies. I was almost certain that Rebecca Martinez had had a similar mark, though I had not paid attention to it at the time. If Maria Santos had had one as well, I had missed it completely. The puncture mark suggested that all 3 women might have been injected with something before their deaths. But what and why, and by whom, I could not begin to guess. I was so focused on my examination that I almost missed the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. I froze, listening intently, and heard the soft squeak of shoes on linoleum approaching the preparation room. Someone else was in the building. I quickly put Jennifer's body back in the refrigerated unit and looked around for a place to hide. The preparation room had few options, but I managed to squeeze into a supply closet just as the door to the room opened. Through the crack in the closet door, I could see a figure enter the room. It was a man I did not recognize, tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and gloves. He moved with quiet confidence, as if he belonged there, and went directly to the refrigerated unit where Jennifer Walsh was stored. He pulled out the drawer and looked down at the body with professional detachment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small vial and a syringe. I watched in horror as he drew liquid from the vial into the syringe and then injected it into Jennifer's neck, just below the hairline, where it would not be easily visible. After the injection, he stood back and observed the body for several minutes, as if waiting for some reaction. Then he returned the vial and syringe to his jacket, closed the drawer, and left the room as quietly as he had entered. I waited in the closet for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, then crept out and checked the building. The intruder was gone, but I could still smell the faint scent of antiseptic that had clung to his clothes. I was terrified and confused, but I knew I had to examine Jennifer's body again. I pulled out the drawer and looked at her neck, where the man had made the injection. There was a tiny puncture mark, barely visible, that had not been there before, but something else had changed as well. Jennifer's skin, which had been pale and waxy with death, now had a faint flush of color. Her lips, which had been blue-tinged, were now a soft pink. Most disturbing of all, when I placed my hand on her chest, I could swear I felt the faintest suggestion of a heartbeat. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This was impossible. Jennifer Walsh was dead. She had been dead for days. But something in that injection was causing changes in her body that defied everything I knew about death and decomposition. I grabbed my phone and called Detective Morrison, not caring that it was 3 a.m. I told him everything about the 3 identical women, about the mysterious intruder, about the injection I had witnessed. Morrison was skeptical, but when I described the man and his actions in detail, his tone became more serious. He told me to stay at the funeral home and not to touch anything else. He would be there within 20 minutes with backup officers. I spent those 20 minutes pacing the hallway, jumping at every sound, terrified that the intruder would return. When Morrison arrived with 2 uniformed officers, I led them to the preparation room and showed them Jennifer Walsh's body. Morrison examined the injection site and agreed that something unusual was happening. He called for a forensics team and ordered that the body be moved to the county morgue for a full autopsy. Over the next several days, the investigation expanded rapidly. The forensics team found traces of an unknown compound in Jennifer's system, something that appeared to be a sophisticated mixture of stimulants and synthetic hormones. The same compound is found when they exhumed and tested the bodies of Rebecca Martinez and Maria Santos. More disturbing still, all 3 women had been injected with this compound after death, not before. Someone was systematically treating corpses with an experimental drug, and the results were unlike anything the medical examiner had ever seen. The compound was causing limited cellular regeneration in the bodies, essentially bringing them back to a state that resembled life. Heart function was restored, blood circulation resumed, and brain activity showed minimal but measurable patterns. The women were not truly alive, but they were not completely dead either. Detective Morrison's investigation uncovered a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the city's funeral industry. The mysterious intruder was Dr. Marcus Hoffman, a disgraced medical researcher who had been expelled from the University of Oregon 5 years earlier for conducting unauthorized experiments on human subjects. Dr. Hoffman had been working with a group of unethical funeral directors and coroners to obtain fresh corpses for his research. He was attempting to develop a serum that could reverse death But his experiments were creating something far more sinister. The women he treated were trapped in a state between life and death, aware, but unable to move or speak, experiencing a form of consciousness that was more horrifying than any nightmare. The three women who looked identical were not natural twins or relatives. They were the result of Dr. Hoffman's most recent breakthrough. He had learned to alter the physical appearance of his subjects, molding their faces and bodies to match a template he had created. Rebecca Martinez, Maria Santos, and Jennifer Walsh had all been transformed to look like the same person as part of his effort to create a repeatable process. But why these particular women? And why the elaborate cover-up involving fake accidents and forged death certificates remained unclear until Morrison's team raided Dr. Hoffman's laboratory in an abandoned warehouse in southeast Portland. What they found there was a horror beyond imagination. Dozens of bodies in various stages of Hoffman's experimental process, some barely recognizable as human, others trapped in the same twilight state as the three women I had prepared. Hoffman had been perfecting his technique for years, using the city's transient population and other vulnerable people who would not be missed. The three women who had looked identical were his latest test subjects, chosen because they fit a psychological profile he had developed. Single women with few social connections, histories of depression or legal troubles, people who had moved to Portland recently and had not yet established strong community ties. They were perfect victims because their disappearances would generate minimal investigation. Dr. Hoffman was arrested, but the full extent of his crimes took months to uncover. His research notes revealed that he had been working toward creating an army of the reanimated dead people who could be controlled and directed, but who retained enough of their original consciousness to perform complex tasks. His ultimate goal was to sell this technology to the highest bidder. Whether that was a foreign government, a terrorist organization, or simply someone willing to pay for the ultimate form of slave labor. The women I had prepared were not the only victims. Morrison's investigation found evidence of similar cases in Seattle, Phoenix, and Los Angeles. Dr. Hoffman had been moving from city to city, establishing relationships with corrupt funeral industry workers and conducting his experiments wherever he could find suitable subjects and cover. The psychological impact on me was devastating. I had spent years helping families say goodbye to their loved ones, providing comfort in their darkest moments. To learn that some of the bodies I had prepared were not truly dead, that they might have been aware of what was happening to them, was almost too much to bear. I took extended leave from Riverside Funeral Home and spent several months in therapy trying to process what I had experienced. The nightmares were constant. I would dream of Rebecca Martinez, Maria Santos, and Jennifer Walsh, their eyes opening as I worked on their faces, trying to speak, but unable to make a sound. Harold was understanding, but the scandal surrounding Dr. Hoffman's arrest had damaged the reputation of every funeral home in the city. Families were questioning whether their loved ones had truly been treated with dignity, whether the bodies they had mourned were actually the people they thought they were burying. The industry was under intense scrutiny, and business suffered accordingly. When I finally returned to work, I found it almost impossible to focus on my tasks. Every body that came through the doors made me paranoid. I would examine each one carefully, looking for signs of injection sites, for evidence of tampering, for any indication that they were not truly dead. My colleagues began to worry about my mental state, and I began to wonder if I would ever be able to work in the funeral industry again. The trial of Dr. Marcus Hoffman was a media sensation. The prosecution presented evidence of his crimes in horrific detail, describing the suffering of his victims and the corruption of the system that had allowed him to operate for so long. Hoffman showed no remorse, instead arguing that his research was groundbreaking and that the temporary suffering of his subjects was justified by the potential benefits to humanity. He was convicted on dozens of counts of murder, kidnapping, and desecration of human remains. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even that seemed insufficient, given the magnitude of his crimes. The 3 women whose faces had haunted my nightmares were finally laid to rest properly. Their families, who had learned the horrible truth about what had happened to their loved ones, held memorial services that I attended. I felt obligated to be there to apologize for my role in the deception, even though I had been an unwitting participant. Rebecca Martinez's sister thanked me for recognizing that something was wrong, for being the one person who had noticed the impossible repetition and had acted on it. She said that without my intervention, Dr. Hoffman might have continued his experiments indefinitely, claiming hundreds more victims. But I took little comfort in her words. The knowledge that I had prepared bodies that were not truly dead, that I had unknowingly participated in their torture, was a burden I would carry for the rest of my life. 6 months after the trial, I made the decision to leave the funeral industry entirely. I could no longer trust my ability to provide the dignity and respect that the dead deserved. Every time I looked at a body, I saw the faces of Rebecca, Maria, and Jennifer, and I wondered if the person before me was truly at peace, or trapped in some nightmare state between life and death. I moved to a small town in rural Oregon and took a job teaching art at the local high school. Working with living students, seeing their creativity and energy helped me begin to heal from the trauma I had experienced. But even now, 2 years later, I still have nightmares about those 3 identical faces, and I still jump when I hear the sound of a gurney being wheeled down a hallway. The case of Dr. Marcus Hoffman changed how the funeral industry operates in Oregon and throughout the Pacific Northwest. New regulations require multiple independent inspections of bodies before burial or cremation, and funeral homes must now maintain detailed records of everyone who has access to their facilities. The changes came too late for Hoffman's victims, but they may prevent similar tragedies in the future. Sometimes I wonder if there are other Dr. Hoffmans out there, other mad scientists conducting their experiments in the shadows of the funeral industry. The thought keeps me awake at night, and I find myself scanning obituaries from my old city looking for patterns that might indicate another monster is at work. I also think about the broader implications of what Hoffman was trying to achieve. His research, however, twisted and unethical, had made genuine scientific advances, He had found ways to restore basic biological functions to dead tissue, to manipulate physical appearance, to maintain consciousness in subjects who should have been beyond all sensation. In the hands of ethical researchers, working with proper consent and oversight, such discoveries might have led to revolutionary medical treatments. But Hoffman had chosen the path of horror instead of healing. He had taken the sacred trust that families place in funeral directors and had perverted it into something monstrous. He had stolen not just lives, but deaths, denying his victims the peace that should have been their final right. The 3 women who had appeared on my preparation table will never be forgotten. Their faces identical, yet each representing a unique individual who had been murdered and violated, serve as a reminder of the evil that can hide behind professional facades and institutional trust. They were not just victims of a madman's experiments. They were symbols of everyone who is vulnerable, everyone who can be preyed upon by those who abuse positions of authority and access. I think about them every day, and I hope that wherever they are now, they have finally found the peace that was stolen from them in those horrible weeks when their bodies were trapped between life and death. I hope that my small role in exposing the truth about their suffering has given them some measure of justice, even if it can never undo the horror they experienced. The mortuary makeup artist who prepared their bodies for burial was forever changed by the encounter. I learned that death is not always the end, that sometimes it can be the beginning of something far worse than any natural death. I learned that the boundary between life and death is not as clear as I had always believed, and that there are people in this world who will cross any line in pursuit of their obsessions. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust your instincts, even when everyone around you thinks you are seeing things that are not there. If I had listened to Harold, if I had accepted the easy explanations and dismissed my concerns as stress or imagination, Dr. Hoffman might still be conducting his experiments today. The faces of Rebecca Martinez, Maria Santos, and Jennifer Walsh will never leave me. They appear in my dreams, in my waking thoughts, in the corners of my vision when I'm not expecting them. But I no longer see them as symbols of horror. Instead, I see them as reminders that even in the darkest circumstances, truth can prevail, justice can be served, and the dead can finally find peace. That is the story of how a mortuary makeup artist discovered that some nightmares are real, and how 3 identical faces changed everything. I thought I knew about life, death, and the thin line that separates them. It is a story I never wanted to live through, but one that I am grateful to have survived. Because in the end, the living have a responsibility to the dead, and sometimes that responsibility requires us to see what others cannot, to speak when others remain silent, and to act when others would prefer to look away. The dead cannot speak for themselves, but they can still find justice if the living are willing to listen to what their silence is trying to tell us.